What's the scariest thing that's ever happened to you in real life? Story 1. 2 years ago, my youth group at church took a trip down to a youth convention in Ohio. It was about a week-long trip, and it was pretty fun. On the drive there and back, we stayed at a church for a night because the trip was a very long one. When we stopped on the way back, that church's youth group happened to be there as well. A friend of mine and I met this girl who told us about catacombs beneath the church, as well as a crawl space that went through the church's walls. The catacombs were sealed off and no one was supposed to go in them, but the girls showed us the entrance to the crawl space, which was in the middle of the wall in the boiler room, about 4 feet up. It was roughly 4 feet high by 4 feet wide, covered in about an inch of dust and coated in black mold, and obviously there was no light. My friend and I were both kind of stupid and liked urban exploring, so we decided to crawl up into the crawl space as soon as the girl left and see how far back it went. Since there was black mold and tons of dust, we held our shirts over our mouths and noses so we would not breathe it in. Neither of us could stand up fully, so we had to crouch as we moved. All we had for light were our phone flashlights, and when we shined them down the tunnel, we could not see the end. The girl had told us the crawl space did not go outside the church, and the building itself was not that big, so we assumed we had just misjudged its size. But the crawl space kept going, and we must have been crawling back there for at least 30 minutes. After a while, we started getting anxious, and when we looked back down the tunnel, we had gone so far that we could not see the entrance. The light was still on in the boiler room, and we still could not see it, so we stopped to catch our breath because we had been crouch walking for a solid 30 minutes and needed to decide whether to turn back. We chose to keep going a little longer, and after a few more minutes, we reached a turn. We followed it, and then it turned again and kept going. By that point, we had both accepted that we were outside the church building's perimeter, meaning either the girl did not know or she lied to us. Then we reached a cross-section that opened up wide enough for us to stand, but to keep going, we had to walk sideways. One direction ended in a dead end a few feet away, but the other continued on, so we went that way. It went on for a while before reaching a very old-looking gate that was rusted shut and locked with an ancient-looking bolt. We could not open it, and from what we could see, everything past the gate dropped down into nothing but darkness. We turned around to head back, but when we reached the cross-section again, we noticed two things. First, when we had been there before, the dead end was empty, but now there was a metal folding chair sitting in the middle of it. Our first reaction was that maybe we had missed it, but the girl had told us no one went back there, and the entire crawl space was covered in at least an inch of dust. The dead end was no exception, yet the chair looked shiny and new and had no dust on it at all, and there were no footprints around it. My friend had recorded part of our exploration, planning to post it later, and when we checked the footage, we confirmed the chair had not been there the first time. That alone made us panic. The second thing we noticed was a gap between the wall and the floor near the dead end, about 1.5 feet wide, completely dark on the other side. After standing frozen in silence for a moment, we heard a long, drawn-out exhaling sound, followed by a loud scrape and a heavy metal clang. My friend screamed, then I screamed, and we took off down the tunnel. We were bent over, crouching, holding our shirts over our faces, barely able to breathe, and behind us we could hear loud scuffling sounds that kept getting closer. We ran all the way back to the boiler room. I held my friend's phone while she jumped out of the crawl space, and when I looked back and shined my flashlight down the tunnel, I saw something moving toward us. It was too dark and too far away to tell what it was, but it was big and clearly moving. We got out of the boiler room as fast as we could and locked the door. When we returned to the youth room, everyone was there. We were the only ones who knew about the crawl space. All the other adults were working elsewhere in the building, and all members of the church's youth group were accounted for. According to the people we asked, no one had gone into the crawl space for years, and they confirmed that it only ran through the church. To this day, neither of us truly knows what happened. I do not believe in ghosts or anything like that, but there was something in that crawl space. It went much farther than the building should have allowed, and the chair still makes no sense. My friend and I do not talk very often anymore, but if you asked either of us, we would still say the chair was not there before, the crawl space extended farther than it was supposed to, and something followed us out, and even now thinking about it still unsettles me more than anything else that has ever happened to me. Story 2. Years ago, in my early 20s, I was suddenly and aggressively stalked by an old pickup truck at midnight and genuinely ran for my life, convinced I was about to be kidnapped or killed. I am male and was 32 at the time of writing this, but back in 2017 I was almost 24 and looked very young, thin with shaggy blonde hair, and I have always had a sort of bouncy walk. So from far away, I apparently looked like a kid walking, which meant I was often mistaken for a high school student by people who did not know me. Around midnight, I was walking about a block away from my house on completely empty streets when a dingy old pickup truck passed me, only to suddenly pull into the grass about 100 feet ahead and quickly turn around. I immediately turned left and headed toward my apartment, since it was only about a 4-minute walk away. The truck turned onto the street I was on, and I instantly started panicking, breaking into a run through a small park about 30 feet from the road while the truck stayed parallel to me. I tripped and fell onto the mulch and said out loud that I was going to die, because that was genuinely what I believed in that moment. I kept slipping as I tried to get back up, nearly falling again, just trying to regain my footing and run at the same time. I made it to the small, narrow street where my apartment was located, and the truck slowed down, coasting right alongside me about 4 feet away. Part of me briefly considered stopping to confront the driver, wondering if it was just some random person trying to scare me. But the fear of being met with a weapon completely shut that idea down. My fight or flight response fully kicked in, and I cut through another neighbor's yard, staying in the shadows and sneaking back to my apartment so the driver would not see where I went. Once inside, I kept all the lights off and watched from the window as the truck circled my block 3 different times before finally driving away. Story 3. Something I witnessed as a child that I have never been able to explain, and something I went back and forth on for years before ever sharing. I am keeping everything anonymous and vague because I do not want this tied back to me or my family, and I have only ever talked about it with very close relatives. This happened when I was very young, but still old enough to remember it clearly, and my family is Christian and believes in God. So while I did not understand much at the time, now that I am older, I view this as something spiritual and deeply unsettling. At the time, we lived in a house where the living room and kitchen were one open space, and we had an old family desktop computer set up in the living room near the television. One night, while both of my parents were home and my siblings and I were all in the same area, my oldest sister was on the computer watching one of those pop-up scare videos that were popular back then. She called me over to watch it. I got startled, laughed it off, and went back to playing. Then she called another one of my sisters over without warning her, and while I was not watching directly, I suddenly heard my sister scream at the top of her lungs. When I turned around, she was visibly shaking, and my mom immediately ran over and grabbed her, while my dad started yelling, asking what she had been shown, as everything escalated very quickly. My sister was shaking uncontrollably and then suddenly went limp, her arms dropping to her sides. And I remember my mom looking terrified in a way I had never seen before, as she called our pastor late at night and said we needed to come see him immediately. While my dad got the car ready, my mom sent me into a bedroom with my sister, and I sat next to her on the bed holding her hand, trying to comfort her the only way I knew how, quietly telling her that everything was going to be okay. What still haunts me is how cold she felt, not just cold hands, but cold in a way that did not feel alive. And years later, after attending funerals, I realized it felt exactly like touching someone who had passed away. While I was holding her hand, she suddenly turned her head very fast and looked directly at me, and her eyes were completely black. And I remember feeling an overwhelming sense that whatever I was looking at was not my sister, and yet somehow still was. And now that I am older, I believe something was very wrong in that moment. We drove to the church and went inside, and a teenager tried to help by gently touching my sister's hands. But the moment she looked at him, he backed away and went to get the pastor. We were brought into the main area of the church, and my parents told me everything was fine, but I knew it was not. And I sat behind my dad while the pastor and others prayed over my sister, rebuking whatever was happening in the name of God. When my sister began screaming, it did not sound like her voice at all, but deep, distorted, and completely unrecognizable, repeating that it hurt, and later she told me she was not in pain, but that whatever was happening inside her was reacting. At some point, my dad picked me up and tried to block my view, telling me not to look. But I looked anyway and saw my sister twitching and moving in ways that did not look normal or human. And I remember hugging my dad tightly, frozen with fear. After that night, no one talked about it again. And years later, when I was older, I finally asked my sister what had happened. And she told me that when she watched the video, she felt something suddenly enter her body. Everything went black, and she felt like she was watching herself from outside, able to see both herself and whatever was inside her. She also told me that when she turned her head and looked at me that night, she was scared that whatever had taken control was going to come after me next. And when the prayers ended, she suddenly felt like she was back in her body, exhausted, terrified, and afraid it would happen again. To this day, she barely talks about it and only says it was the worst experience of her life. And I am not trying to convince anyone of anything. I just know what I saw, what I felt, and how clearly this memory has stayed with me. And as a Christian, I believe it was something spiritual that I have never been able to forget or fully explain. Story 4. It was a late night, around 9 or 10 in the evening, when I got into the car with 4 other girls and 3 guys. And for anonymity, I will call the girls Kylie, Leslie, Sarah, and Maria, and the guys Noah, Alex, and Sammy. We were heading to Gainesville just for fun, to take photos and spend a night away from home. We arrived in Gainesville about 2 hours later, sometime around 11:30 or midnight. We took photos at a basketball court and then headed to a nice hotel that was about 7 or 8 stories tall. Across the street was a small Wawa, and nearby there was a highway with a bridge crossing over the intersection, and next to it a forest-type area with lots of trees. We went inside, got settled, and then ended up going back out to the parking lot to smoke and hang out, and everyone was drinking except for me. Little did I know the scariest moment of my life was about to happen. Everyone was in the parking lot except Sammy, and we were all standing around when Leslie suddenly started acting scared and walking away from the group at a fast pace. The other girls said she was just playing around or that she was tripping, but I was the only one who followed her to make sure she was okay. I followed her behind 2 cars from our group that were parked behind the vehicle we arrived in, and as I followed her, she got more and more scared, almost like she was about to cry. She kept saying that it was coming, and my heart dropped because I was confused and tried to calm her down, asking what she meant by that. She just got more upset and repeated that it was coming. And not even a few seconds after she said it the second time, we heard a deafening scream. It did not sound human or like any animal I had ever heard, and something in me immediately knew it was not normal. The strangest part was that when I jogged back to the group, they were completely unfazed. I asked everyone if they had just heard that scream, and they said they did not hear anything, which made no sense because of how loud it was. Leslie and I ran back into the hotel from the parking lot and even asked the front desk if they had heard anything, because it was loud enough that it should have been heard inside the building, but they had not heard it either, and we must have looked completely crazy. We said never mind and went up to the hotel room, and both of us were speechless, trying to understand how no one else heard it and having no idea what it was. We tried to explain to Sammy what we heard, but we only sounded more unhinged to him, and he suggested we should just go to sleep. Later, we looked out the window toward the direction where the scream came from and saw multiple police vehicles and even a special response unit heading that way, but with no lights or sirens, which made everything feel even more unsettling. To this day, I still do not understand what that sound was or what Leslie meant when she said it was coming, and I honestly hope I never experience anything like that again, because I still wish I had some kind of answer about what happened that night, and I have not spoken to her since, though I have thought about reaching out to ask what she remembers. Story 5. I am female and in my 50s now, and I grew up predominantly in the 1980s, living in Sydney with my mom, dad, and my 2 younger sisters. Whenever my parents went out, we usually had family members look after us, but by the time I was 12, they finally decided they trusted me to babysit my sisters on my own, and this story happened the very first time I ever did. My parents planned to go out for movies and dinner on a Saturday night, having found a midnight screening of one of their favorite films from their childhood, so they knew they would not be home until around 1 or 2 in the morning. At about 11 in the evening, the 3 of us were still awake together, sitting in the dark with all the lights off and watching television, when we heard some rustling sounds coming from the front yard. I brushed it off as wind or maybe a cat and did not worry too much. But about 2 minutes later, there was a loud banging on the front door, far louder than anything a normal or friendly visitor would ever do. The three of us were immediately terrified, but we went silent and turned the television off. Even back in the 1980s, there was absolutely no way I was opening the door to anyone that late at night, especially knowing it was not our parents. Then there was another loud bang on the door, and I slowly crept toward the front entrance. Thankfully, the door was almost entirely solid wood, with only a few narrow strips of heavily colored and frosted glass, so whoever was outside could not see in. We crouched there and barely managed to make out the outline of a figure standing on the other side. Suddenly, the doorknob started rattling, and it was clear this person was trying to get into the house. I did not know if they realized we were home, and I was too scared to make any noise. But I knew I had to do something, so I quickly grabbed a wooden doorstop and quietly wedged it under the door in hopes it would keep it shut. Our only phone was right by the front door, and I was too afraid to use it in case they heard us. So I rushed my sisters upstairs to my parents' bedroom, where we huddled together. From that room, we could see the front stoop through the window, which had no blinds, only heavy curtains. And even though I knew we should not look, none of us could resist. We slowly slipped our heads under the curtains, just enough to peek outside without pulling them open. What we saw has fueled our nightmares ever since. There was an old man standing there, and the moment we looked out, his eyes were locked directly on us, as if he knew exactly where we were and had been waiting for us to look. His face was twisted into the most menacing scowl, and he was holding a brown paper bag by the top, making it obvious that something was inside. He slowly lifted the bag up beside his head, then raised his other arm and pointed at it, slowly moving his forearm back and forth in a disturbing gesture toward whatever was inside the bag. The entire moment lasted maybe 5 seconds before we all dropped back down in fear. About a minute later, I carefully stood up again and edged toward the side of the curtain, hoping to see without being seen, and when I looked, he was gone. My sisters and I stayed huddled together on the bedroom floor for what felt like forever, terrified until our parents finally came home. I remember us crying hysterically as we told them everything, and I think my dad filed a police report, but nothing ever came of it, and we never saw that man again. Story 6, I have been thinking about this for years, and neither my family nor I have ever come up with an explanation for it or any way to properly debunk it. From what I can remember, I was around 8 years old when this happened, so part of me has wondered if it could have been my imagination, but I highly doubt that. The story begins when my family and I planned to stay at my grandparents' house over the Christmas holidays, something we had done for years. My grandparents lived in a very isolated area, mostly surrounded by large empty fields of land owned either by my grandfather or by other farmers nearby. Because of this, there were no parks or other kids for me and my siblings to play with, and we did not have much to entertain ourselves other than playing hide and seek in the extremely overgrown grass or sitting on my grandfather's tractor. One evening after we finished dinner, we asked our grandma if we could go back outside, and she agreed, but told us not to go too deep into the fields, and said that if we did, we should just stay put until she came to find us. As usual, my siblings and I started playing hide and seek, but after a while I realized I could no longer hear their footsteps, and I knew I had gone too deep. I no longer knew exactly where I was, but I could tell I was about 2 full fields away from my siblings, and that my grandparents' house was somewhere far to my left. Even so, I stayed where I was because I was scared that moving around would only take me deeper into the fields and get me into more trouble. Eventually, I heard another pair of footsteps, moving quickly and coming from my right, and then I heard what sounded like my older sister calling my name. It sounded close, but even through the thin grass, I could not see her. Being a child, I followed her voice, even though it was leading me in the opposite direction from my grandparents' house. I followed it for what I remember being close to 20 minutes, and each time I heard her, her voice seemed to drift farther and farther away. Suddenly, as I was walking, I noticed a specific tree in the distance, and I realized I was now on another farmer's land that I was strictly forbidden to enter. That was the moment I knew whatever I had been following was not my sister. She was a strict follower of my grandparents' rules and would never step off my grandfather's land onto someone else's property. I have never felt such a horrible sinking feeling in my stomach before or since. I immediately turned and ran back the way I came, but I could still hear rustling behind me, which was absolutely terrifying. I could also hear that thing calling my name, but the voice sounded more and more disturbing, with strange grunts and gurgling sounds mixed in between each breath. Eventually, a nearby elderly couple found me curled up on the ground, hiding beneath the grass, and they took me inside and called my parents to let them know they had found me. It turned out that all of my other siblings, including my older sister, had gone back inside after the first 10 minutes of being outside, except for my little brother, and everyone had assumed I was still playing somewhere nearby. What felt like about 30 minutes to me was actually 3 full hours, and I had walked roughly 8.5 miles. My parents were close to filing a report when I was finally found. Since that day, I have never gone back into those fields, and even now when I visit, I make sure to stay far away from them. Story 7. The first time this happened was when I was 8 years old, and for reference, in that house, my bedroom was on the level below the rest of my family, with my windows facing a fence gate that people would often walk past. I was asleep, and I am not a very light sleeper at all, since I have even slept through a smoke alarm going off before. I suddenly felt a tap on my shoulder and assumed it was my mom or my sister. So I turned to face where the tap came from, and a pillow that normally decorated my bed was shoved directly into my face. It was around 3 in the morning, and right after that I heard footsteps going upstairs. I screamed into the pillow, shaking and trying not to wake anyone. Eventually I convinced myself it had to be my sister playing a prank on me. So in the morning I confronted her about it, but she swore it was not her and genuinely looked worried by what I was telling her. My mom suggested that maybe I had somehow hit myself with the pillow, but that explanation never made sense to me, because the decorative pillows I removed from my bed to sleep are always placed on the other side of my room, meaning I would have had to get out of bed, walk over, grab them, get back into bed facing the opposite direction, roll over, and then hit myself. I do sleepwalk occasionally, so it was not completely out of the question for her, but when I woke up, the pillow was next to my bed instead of across the room where it should have been. I never really forgot about that experience, but it came back even stronger when I was 10 years old. We had just moved houses, and this time my room was on the same level as everyone else. I was asleep when I felt someone's presence standing on the other side of my bed, which lightly woke me up. I did not roll over to look, but I stayed completely still while fully aware of it. Then the same thing happened again, except this time it was the plush toy I slept with being pressed into my face. I did not hear anyone run away, and I did not scream either. I just lay there shaking in fear. This time, I did not tell anyone about it because I knew I was not sleepwalking or doing it to myself, and that was the only explanation anyone ever offered. Since the first house I mentioned, I have been afraid of the dark, and these events only intensified that fear. One time a canvas painting fell off my wall, and I screamed so loudly that my mom thought I had fallen out of bed, only to find me still lying there shaking. To this day, I honestly just want to know if anyone else has experienced something similar, or if there is any explanation for what might have happened. Story 8. I live in Northeast Ohio, in Portage County, and over the past few years I have experienced multiple unsettling encounters that I have never been able to fully explain. And while they used to terrify me, they have now left me more exhausted and anxious than anything else. These experiences usually happen late at night, anywhere from midnight to early morning hours, and there were many times when I was so frightened that I could not sleep at all and did not feel safe until the sun came up. One of the most recent incidents happened while I had my bedroom window open at night. I rent an apartment on the third floor of an old house that was converted into multiple units, and I was sitting on my bed while my cat was loudly meowing for treats when I suddenly heard something outside attempting to meow back at him. It sounded wrong, distorted, and unsettling, like a very poor imitation of a cat, and what made it worse was that I was on the third floor. From my perspective, whatever made the sound would have had to climb the outside of the house to reach my window. The moment I heard it, I reacted on instinct, jumped up, and rushed to close and lock the window before pulling the blinds shut, acting so fast that I did not even look outside. I then closed my bedroom door, terrified, and gently pushed my cat under the bed to get him to stop making noise because I felt like any sound might draw attention. After waiting for about an hour, I carefully checked the apartment to make sure all the windows were locked and the blinds were closed. The only thing separating me from the outside at that moment had been a window screen. And since the building was constructed in the 1920s, there is an external fire ladder built into the side of the house near my window. Over time, I spoke with a friend who follows indigenous spiritual beliefs and shared stories of similar experiences, and hearing that only reinforced my fear. Because of everything that has happened, I avoid going outside at night entirely, keep my curtains closed as soon as it gets dark, and stay away from wooded areas, especially alone. These experiences have left me extremely cautious even during the daytime, and my anxiety has not fully gone away. The first time something like this happened at this house was in 2024, when I was living in a second-floor studio apartment. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night with my window open and heard what sounded like a cat crying in pain somewhere behind the house, and I froze completely, unable to move or even think clearly. As I listened, the sound seemed to change, slowly shifting from a distressed animal to something that resembled a crying baby, and then gradually into something closer to a howling dog, which left me feeling numb and detached from my body. Eventually the sound stopped, but I stayed frozen in bed for hours and only felt safe once the sun rose. After that night, I avoided going outside for days, taped the edges of my curtains shut, and limited my time outdoors to daylight hours only. Since then, certain noises outside can still make me freeze in fear until I can calm myself and remind myself that I am safe and that it could be something ordinary. Over time, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings and developed coping strategies for when I feel unsafe, including contacting authorities if I hear something that sounds like a person in distress or using noise to draw attention away from my apartment. I do not claim to understand what these experiences were or to convince anyone of a specific explanation, but they felt very real to me in the moment and left a lasting impact. I have experienced this kind of fear multiple times, and because of it, I trust my instincts more than ever, stay alert, and prioritize my safety whenever something feels off, especially at night. Story 9. I have never told anyone this story in real life, not my parents and not my friends, and even now, years later, I still do not know if the man in that field was just watching us or waiting for something far worse to happen. This took place about 3 years ago, and at the time I was in complete shock and had no idea who to talk to, so the two friends I was with that night and I decided to keep it to ourselves. I had two close friends, who I will call Zach and Jake, and one random day we were bored and decided to throw a party at Zach's house over the weekend. He had a large house, a huge backyard, and a pool, and it was the weekend right before spring break, with his parents out of town, so everything lined up perfectly. On the day of the party, we met up hours early to set things up, and later that night around 80 people showed up, with even more arriving as the night went on, and that is when the drinking really started. Around 1:30 in the morning, people began leaving, but the three of us still had a lot of energy. Zach's house was the last one in the neighborhood, and behind his backyard stretched a massive cornfield that went on for roughly a mile, with no houses behind it at all, just open land. And there was a gate in his yard that led directly into the field. Zach owned a Can-Am with 2 seats and space on the back to stand, and around 2 in the morning, we had the idea to take it into the field while blasting music. I was driving, Zach sat in the passenger seat, and Jake stood on the back as we rode around for about 30 minutes before getting bored and deciding to head back, taking one final turn through the field. Halfway through, a man suddenly appeared in the headlights, looking around 60 years old with gray hair, wearing a vest and holding a hunting rifle with a scope, barely visible in the darkness except for what the headlights caught. We drove past him without stopping, and about 500 feet later, the Can-Am shut off completely on its own, even though the keys were still in the ignition, and my heart dropped. We were close enough that he could still hear or see us, but when we looked back, he was gone. After a few seconds that felt like minutes, the vehicle started again, and without saying a word, we drove straight back toward the house. Before going inside, we stopped to catch our breath and process what had happened, when we suddenly heard a loud bang and felt something metal strike the Can-Am, freezing us in place. A moment later, we heard another shot and something flew past us, and that was enough to send us racing back, speeding through the yard, parking, running inside, and locking every door and window while turning off all the lights. Zach had security cameras, so we sat in the room with the monitors showing the yard in front of the house. And that was when it got worse. A car slowly drove into the area near the backyard and stopped, leaving its headlights on and idling there for about 15 minutes without anyone getting out. While we stayed completely silent, afraid to even move, until it finally drove away. None of us slept that night, and what scared us most was trying to understand why an elderly man would be standing in the middle of a cornfield in the early morning hours, and how a car could have been so close to the house shortly afterward. The next day we checked maps to see where he could have come from, and there were no houses or shelters anywhere nearby, meaning he was either out there the entire time or watching us throughout the party. We never told anyone, and although 3 years have passed and we have all gone our separate ways, it is a night I will never forget, and one that still comes back to me whenever I hear something outside late at night. Story 10. One night around 10 or 11 in the evening, my dad suddenly decided we should go camping, and since my family has always been the adventurous type, deciding to camp late at night was completely normal for us. We already had a place in mind, a forest where my mom owns some property, so we packed up and headed out. When we arrived, my dad and I set up the tents and started a campfire, and after we settled in, I grabbed some peanuts and decided to take a short stroll through the forest. It felt calm and peaceful, with the only sounds being the trees swaying and the leaves brushing against each other, and I honestly felt completely at ease. Everything felt perfect until I noticed something ahead of me. Standing there was a tall figure, easily around 8 feet, with what looked like antler-shaped horns and a face that reminded me of a wolf. And in that moment, all I could think was that real life is not like a movie where you somehow survive situations like that. I ran without looking back, not tripping or falling like in a horror film, just running as fast as I could. At some point, I collided with someone, but I could not make out what they looked like because the only light was from the moon, and I had not brought a flashlight with me, since I thought the walk would just be a calm and atmospheric moment. The person grabbed my shoulder and motioned for me to stay quiet, pointing in a direction with their other hand, then gently pushed me that way, and I did not hesitate for even a second before sprinting off. Somehow I ended up back at our campsite, where my mom and dad were already asleep. I stayed awake the entire night, alert and unable to relax. The next morning I told my parents everything that had happened, and to my shock, they just laughed. I remember asking them why they were laughing when I felt like I had almost died, and my dad simply patted my head and walked toward the river to wash our things, while my mom kissed my forehead and quietly told me to be careful next time. That was 3 years ago, and I still do not know what I saw in the forest or who the person was that helped me get away. Every time I try to bring it up to my family, they change the subject, but I know what I experienced. I know I ran into someone, and I know that night left a mark on me that I have never been able to fully explain. Story 11. I was about 5 or 6 years old when this happened, sometime around 2018 or 2019. My cousin, who I will call Maverick, and I were playing hide and seek in a brick field near where we lived, with huge stacks of bricks everywhere, workers moving around, and dust constantly in the air. I was the seeker, so I counted while Maverick ran off to hide, and when I finished counting, I found him pretty quickly behind a brick wall. He told me he was thirsty and said I should wait while he went to get some water, so I stayed there without really thinking much of it. I did not realize how much time had passed because back then, I was a very calm and naive kid, and even when something felt wrong, I did not take it seriously. After what was probably around 2 hours, I started getting annoyed and decided to look for him myself. I asked some of the workers if they had seen him, but they all said no, and little by little the place began to empty out as the sun started going down. One by one the workers left, and suddenly the brick field felt enormous and completely quiet. That was when I heard growling, at first far away, like wolves somewhere in the distance, and then it sounded closer. My stomach tightened, but I still did not cry or run, because I did not fully understand how dangerous the situation might have been. Then 2 men appeared, looking completely normal, calm and friendly, and they told me they would help me get out. I do not remember questioning them at all, I just trusted them. There was a bicycle nearby, and I sat on the seat while they walked beside it, guiding me toward the exit. As we were moving, something made me look down, and that was when I noticed their feet were not touching the ground. There were no toes and no soles, just legs floating slightly above the dirt. I panicked internally but forced myself to stay calm, telling myself I was just tired, that I had not had any water, and that my brain was making things up. When we reached the exit, I saw my mom running toward me, looking terrified, and she hugged me immediately, asking if I was okay, where I had been, and who had helped me get out. I turned around to show her the two men, but they were gone, completely gone. Later, I found out that Maverick had gone home and told everyone nothing. And instead of getting in trouble, he was praised and kissed by his grandmother, while no one truly realized that I had been missing for hours. I still do not know who those two men were, but one thing I remember clearly is that they helped me leave, and their feet never touched the ground. Story 12. It was late August, and I was 9 years old at the time, walking around the neighborhood with my friends, G, who was maybe 12, S, who was 9 like me, and G's little sister M, who was 5. We wandered into a cul-de-sac that we thought was familiar, but it turned out to be on the opposite side of the neighborhood from where we usually hung out. We walked past a mint green house that I think had 2 stories, with a roof that looked worn down, an overgrown lawn, and a rusty black car sitting in the yard that clearly had not been used in a long time. 2 dogs were in the yard, one long-limbed and brown, and the other what looked like a black Labrador, barking and jumping up at the old car. A woman with a long neck, glasses, and a messy bun opened the door, smiled at us, and invited us onto her lawn to pet the dogs. We all exchanged looks but decided to go along with it, even though all of us, except maybe M, knew about stranger danger. As we got closer, a foul smell hit us, like meat left too long in the fridge, and we eventually realized it seemed to be coming from the car. I noticed G craning her neck to try and look inside the car windows, but they were fogged up and blocked by the dogs jumping. We stayed there for a while as the woman talked to us, asking innocent-sounding questions about school, our ages, and where we lived. After some time, a middle-aged man drove by in a large navy-colored car and rolled down his window, telling us kids to go home and warning us that the woman was not as nice as she looked. M, who was very anxious, immediately told G she wanted to go home, while S and I told the man he was being weird. He muttered something and drove away, but we heard a crash as he threw a glass bottle out of his window on the other side of the cul-de-sac. The woman looked upset and invited us inside, saying the man was bad, and when we hesitated, she told a disturbing story about him having sons who chose a life he did not approve of and how he supposedly killed them. That scared us enough that we went inside, with M coming in last only because she was too scared to be alone outside. Inside the house, a man was yelling at a television that was extremely loud, and when he turned and saw us, he looked confused at first. Then his eyes widened and he nodded before sitting back down and watching more quietly. I started feeling strongly that something was wrong, especially when the woman left us alone to go into the kitchen, saying she was baking cookies. I told G and S how I felt, and while G brushed it off, S agreed with me, and M was begging to go home. Eventually, we all decided to leave. As we turned back toward the road, the man suddenly ran outside and stopped at the edge of the lawn, as if he was afraid to come any closer, calling out for us to come back and saying the food was almost done and our parents would not mind. One of the dogs growled at him, and after he said something I could not hear, both dogs started walking toward us. That was when fear really set in. G picked M up and carried her while the rest of us ran as fast as we could back toward our homes. I was shaking when I made sure S got home safely and then went to my own house where I told my dad, though I left out many of the stranger details. The next day at school, G told me her parents had called the police and that there had been a whole interrogation. We never went back to that area again and stuck to our usual cul-de-sac, and the following year I moved away, so I never saw that house again, but I still hope those people are no longer there. Story 13. Back in 2015, when I was about 10 years old, my family had recently moved to a small suburban neighborhood where our new house was still under construction, and since my father was working in a different country at the time, my mom, my older sister, and I stayed in a rental house in the same area until our home was ready. To be honest, I never really liked that rented house. Not because it was obviously creepy, But because it always felt strangely isolated, with no one within a 2 or 3 house radius ever staying longer than a few months, and it never gave me a sense of comfort or belonging, though over time I adjusted and stopped thinking about it as much. The house was a duplex, with the kitchen, dining room, and living room downstairs and 3 bedrooms upstairs. And because of that layout, if I yelled for my mom from my room, she would not hear me if she was downstairs, which made me uneasy about being alone in any part of the house. Something I blamed on the fact that it was new to me and that I had watched far too many horror movies. About 2 months after moving in, during summer vacation, I invited 3 close friends over for a sleepover, and after a full day of hanging out, we decided to end the night by watching a horror movie. Ouija from 2014, turning off all the lights, drawing the curtains, pulling an old mattress onto the floor, and starting the movie while my mom and sister had already gone to bed. Early in the film, there is a scene where a character is home alone. The power goes out, and a single light flickers before she becomes possessed and dies. And I swear that the exact moment that scene ended, the power in our house went out, and everything went completely dark at around 1 in the morning. At first, we found it hilarious, since power cuts were not unheard of in the neighborhood, and we laughed and messed around in the dark, until suddenly we heard the sound of an old fluorescent light slowly flickering on behind us. That was when my fear truly set in, because I remembered clearly that a handyman had once told us that this specific bulb was no longer connected to the wiring after the house had been renovated, and that it could never turn on. And yet there we were, in total darkness, with one single light flickering exactly like in the movie. For several seconds, none of us could move or speak, and then we all screamed at once, loud enough that my mom and sister came running downstairs. By the time they reached us, we were running away from the light in sheer panic, and I was so desperate to get out of the house that I had already cracked open the front door when my mom grabbed it and slammed it shut, furious and confused. Eventually, the power came back, and once everyone calmed down, we explained everything in detail. But my mom assumed the flickering light was some kind of prank and dismissed it as boys being boys, even though that light had never worked before. We eventually went to bed, but none of us slept. And when morning came and my friends left, I was the only one left in the house who knew something was deeply wrong. Days later, while my sister and I were out, the power went out again while my mom was home alone, and that same light flickered back on, which she interpreted as something divine, calling it God's light, while I refused to believe that explanation. From that night on, every time there was a power outage, that light would flicker on without fail, always reminding me of the moment it first happened. And no matter how many times people brushed it off, I felt like the house was mocking me. Once our new house was finished, I left the whole experience behind. But years later, after graduating college and returning home, I passed by that same rental house, unchanged after a decade. And even though it looked like someone still lived there, I would never dare step inside again. Story 14. Although I cannot remember the exact year, it was either 2016 or 2017 when I was most likely 16 years old. I had been living in the Republic of Ireland for just under 3 years at that point, having moved from England, and my family and I lived in the Midlands in a very small town. During my teenage years, because my life felt extremely depressing, mostly due to how much I hated school, I began believing in God more seriously and praying regularly, naively thinking that if I did, He would somehow magically make my life better. It was during this spiritual phase that I came across a certain video on YouTube about a man who claimed he had been taken by Jesus to hell, where he was shown endless horrors and the suffering of souls being punished by demonic entities. According to the man, after witnessing these things, he woke up in his bed as if from a dream, but insisted that what he experienced was not a dream at all, but a real glimpse of what awaited sinners. Whether or not the story was true, it deeply frightened me and left me terrified of the idea of eternal punishment. Not long after watching the video, however, I began feeling extremely unsettled, not directly because of the video itself, but because I suddenly felt as though I was being watched while I was alone in my bedroom. Along with that feeling came a strong sense of danger, intense enough that I decided to leave my room and go downstairs where my parents and sister were. What happened next was the most disturbing part of the experience, because as soon as I reached the bottom of the stairs, before I even entered another room, I felt a hard physical tap on the back of my shoulder. I immediately turned around and screamed. Genuinely screamed. But when I did, there was no one there at all, as if whatever touched me had vanished. I screamed so loudly that my mom shouted from the living room, asking what was wrong. For the rest of that evening, I was incredibly frightened and jumpy, to the point where every small noise or movement made me paranoid. And I was so on edge that even my dog, who was still a small puppy at the time, scared me whenever she came near me. We only lived in that house for a few more months before moving, and I never experienced anything like that again, nor have I since. Although I enjoy scary stories, both real and fictional, I do not know much about demons or ghosts and usually find topics like aliens and cryptids far more interesting. I am not sharing this story to claim that it was definitely a real paranormal experience, because it very well could have been psychological, possibly triggered by fear after watching that video. But if anyone reading this has knowledge of similar experiences, spiritual or psychological, I would genuinely like to hear their thoughts. For the sake of honesty, I should also admit that I believe I had a real UFO experience when I was around 11 years old, which I have already written about. And I know mentioning that does not help my credibility, but I would rather be honest than leave anything out. Whether you believe this was a demonic experience or not is completely fine, but if anyone can help explain what I felt that night, even from a psychological perspective, I would really appreciate hearing your insight. And the main reason I have not shared this story sooner is simply because I doubted anyone would believe both experiences coming from the same person. Story 15. My boyfriend and I were driving back from visiting his cousin after midnight when he asked if I wanted to visit a haunted tunnel that was just up ahead on our route. And since I am not from the area and had never heard of it before, I agreed, asking him not to tell me any of the lore until after we left. We arrived at exactly 1 in the morning, and I had not realized it was a full moon until my boyfriend pointed it out, joking that it was very on brand for us to visit the most haunted place he knew on a full moon. He had been to the Mushroom Tunnel in Picton before, but it had been over a decade since his last visit, and he kept telling me it was the scariest place he had ever been and that he had never actually made it inside. After squeezing through a gap in the fence, you have to walk for a bit until the path splits into 3 directions, with the middle path leading to the tunnel. Because of the full moon, the path was surprisingly well lit, and we were not using flashlights at first, but the closer we got to the tunnel, the darker it became. And once we were within about 10 meters, it was pitch black in a way that felt unnatural. With every step closer, I felt increasingly unsettled. Both of us noticed something deep inside the tunnel that appeared to glow, almost bioluminescent, and to me it vaguely resembled the shape of a person, completely still and silent. The strangest part was that the closer we got, the dimmer the glow became, though it never fully disappeared. My boyfriend told me this was the closest he had ever been, and as we stood right at the entrance, I suddenly felt extremely nauseous. Then we heard a noise, which could have been something harmless like a frog living in the tunnel, but I immediately turned around, said no, and speed walked away. My boyfriend ran after me, asking me not to leave him behind, and when we reached the fork in the path, I realized out loud that we had not taken any pictures. Neither of us wanted to go back, but we also wanted proof, so we turned around and returned to the exact spot where we had been standing, took 2 pictures each, and then heard the same sound again. I did not hesitate and walked out just as quickly as before. As we headed back to the car, I felt intensely nauseous, like I had swallowed something heavy that scraped my throat and settled uncomfortably in my stomach, and we could not leave fast enough. From there we went to the Picton Cemetery, which felt far less disturbing, and while my chest felt heavy in a few spots, there was nothing like the overwhelming urge to leave that I felt at the tunnel. While driving home afterward, my boyfriend finally told me the story behind it, explaining that in 1916 a woman named Emily died in the tunnel after misjudging a train's timing while walking through it, and that his mom had once gone on a guided ghost tour there, where people felt their hair being touched and their shoulders tapped, to the point that she walked out alone because she could not stand being inside any longer. As we continued driving, I was looking up the lore when we saw a massive fox sitting on the side of the road, easily the largest fox either of us had ever seen, sitting upright like a dog with its paws in front. Clearly a fox, but unusually large, which felt strange even if it was unrelated. We got home around 2:30 in the morning and went straight to bed, and my boyfriend later told me that I talked in my sleep all night about the tunnel and how unsettling it was, and I remember dreaming about it too. I am still not sure what to make of the experience, but that was what happened when we visited the Mushroom Tunnel. Story 16. I grew up in this house and was basically born there, and from as far back as I can remember, I always felt that something about it was off. I had nightmares almost every single night until we finally moved out years later. One day my cousin and I were in my room playing on the computer with my bedroom door wide open, which was completely normal for us. We were about 10 and 13 years old at the time. The way the computer was set up, we had our backs to the door, so we could not see it, but we definitely would have heard it if it moved. Suddenly, the door slammed shut loudly as if a person had done it on purpose. We both looked at each other, terrified, because we knew we were home alone. We checked the entire house to see if our parents had come back, but there was nothing and no one there, and I will never forget that moment. Another time I was home alone in the same house, lying down and cuddling with my chihuahua. It was a normal night, just very quiet and lonely since no one else was home, and there was no noise at all, not even from the air conditioning because it did not work at the time. Out of nowhere, I started hearing footsteps coming down the hallway, evenly spaced like a human walking. What made it even stranger was that it sounded like someone wearing big, heavy boots. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining it, since houses can make weird noises. But the sound continued, and then my chihuahua started barking. The moment she barked, I knew something was wrong, and panic set in. I grabbed her and ran straight out of the house, waiting outside until someone finally came home because I was too scared to go back inside. I knew it was not an intruder because there was no realistic way for someone to get in, with a very tall backyard fence, aggressive dogs next door, and burglar bars on every window, and even the sliding door. That left only one explanation in my mind. What scared me the most was how slow and deliberate the footsteps were, and how human they sounded. You know how you can recognize the sound of a family member walking down the hall just by their steps? It was that clear and loud, but I could not recognize it as anyone I knew, and it was definitely something walking on two legs. I am not overly religious or someone who takes these things too seriously, but that house had something strange about it, and I truly believe it could turn even the biggest skeptic into a believer. Story 17. When I was still in school, before I got my license, I usually took the bus, and the bus stop was only a few blocks from my house. There were two different ways to get there. One was walking along the road, turning right, and continuing down the street, which took about 15 minutes. The other was a straight shortcut through a patch of very thick forest, which only took about 10 minutes. One morning I was running late and decided to take the forest path. It was the start of winter, and it was completely pitch black outside at the time I had to wake up for high school. I was either a freshman or a sophomore then. As I walked, I kept my eyes forward, even though every snap and crack made me want to look over my shoulder. Just as I could finally see the bus stop through the trees, I heard an extremely loud snap, like a tree being ripped apart, so loud that it echoed across the surrounding fields. I rushed forward, terrified, and when I reached the stop, there was another kid there, someone in my grade who I barely knew. I debated mentioning the noise, worried I would sound crazy if he had not heard it, but he beat me to it and asked what that sound was, and if I had heard it too. It was still so dark we could barely see each other, even standing a couple of feet apart. I nodded but avoided talking about it, and he seemed to understand and dropped the subject. Normally I would stand far away because I am awkward, but this time I stood unusually close, just wanting some comfort after what had happened. We both went on our phones, but I suddenly felt like something was watching me, not from behind but from directly in front of us. Without lifting my head, I shifted my eyes and saw a figure move into view about 13 feet away. At first it looked like a deer, which is common where I live, so I tried to ignore it, but the uneasy feeling got worse and I looked again. That was when it stood up. I glanced at the other kid to see if he noticed, but he was still looking at his phone. When I looked back, whatever it was seemed to look directly at me. I could not see any features because it was still completely dark, only a shadow, and then it dropped back down on all fours and ran so fast it was just a blur, disappearing into the field behind it. Less than a minute later, the bus pulled up. I got on first, and when the other kid sat behind me, he quietly said that was crazy in the most serious tone I had ever heard from him, which told me he had seen it too. I still do not know what it was, but the memory has stayed with me and still haunts me to this day. Story 18. This happened about a year ago when I was sitting at home and got a random phone call from my mom. And during that call, she told me a story she had never shared before, one that she later wrote down for me word for word. She believes she may have encountered a famous serial killer as a child, and this is her story exactly as she remembers it. She said she must have been 11 or 12 years old at the time because she was still riding her sister's old blue Schwinn girl's bicycle, and she got a new 10-speed bike when she turned 13. She also remembers weighing around 74 pounds, which becomes important later. She was born in 1965, so that places the year of the incident around 1976 or 1977. It was a long time ago, but certain details are still burned into her memory. She remembers wearing jeans, though she does not recall what she was wearing on top, which makes her think it must have been late spring or early fall, because if it had been the middle of summer, she would have been wearing shorts. She was tall for her age, thin, and had shoulder-length light brown hair. Her house was only about a 3-minute bike ride from the Jewel Osco store, and she often rode there alone to buy herself a sweet treat, which is exactly what she did that day. She parked her bike outside and went into the Osco side of the store, where the candy aisle was located close to the entrance. And after looking for a while, she chose a bag of sugar babies. While she was there, a man entered the same aisle and began talking to her. She was shy, naive, and raised to never say no to an adult. So she quietly turned away and walked toward the opposite end of the aisle, then turned into the greeting card aisle. But he followed her and positioned himself directly in front of her. She does not remember everything he said, but she clearly remembers him saying he could guess her weight and asking if he could prove it. She nervously agreed, and he reached behind her, placing his hand between her legs and lifting her slightly by her lower body, then guessed her weight as 74 pounds, which was very close to accurate. She said it felt wrong, but she froze and could not bring herself to protest. There were no other people around. He then offered to buy her candy for her, and although she tried to refuse, he insisted, so she agreed. He smiled and told her to wait outside while he paid, which she now realizes was likely because he did not want to be seen with her. She waited by her bicycle and considered leaving before he came out, but she really wanted the candy and assumed she would just take it and leave. When he exited the store and handed it to her, he told her he had a really cool car and asked if she wanted to see it, then asked her to walk with him into the parking lot. Once again, she agreed. As they walked, she felt a strong sense that she needed to get away, and one smart decision she made was insisting on bringing her bike with her, keeping it physically between them. He led her to the far edge of the parking lot, where beyond that was only empty field, no buildings or roads, and his car was parked with the passenger door facing away from the store. She remembers the car clearly as a beige or tan Volkswagen Beetle, in good condition and possibly new. She stopped a short distance away while he opened the passenger door and invited her to look inside. When he then asked if she wanted to sit in it, alarm bells finally went off, and she nervously told him her mom was waiting for her at home and she needed to leave. To her surprise and relief, he did not argue and simply said goodbye. She jumped on her bike and rode away as fast as she could without looking back. When she got home, she sat in the living room eating her candy and thinking about what had happened, but she did not tell anyone. She says she was afraid she would get in trouble, afraid of making her parents upset, afraid of the attention, and unsure whether what she felt was valid, so she stayed silent for decades. She finally told her own mother when she was in her 40s and regretted it because it made her cry. Her description of the man is vague because she avoided looking directly at him, but she remembers him as average in every way: average height, average build, white skin, possibly brown hair, not especially young or old, and she does not remember his clothing. She wishes she had told someone, because even if he was not who she later suspected, he was clearly dangerous and likely went on to find other victims. My mom told me this story after watching an episode of Dr. Phil about Ted Bundy, and when they showed an image of his tan Volkswagen Beetle, She felt her heart drop because she instantly recognized it. That was the first time she connected the man from the store to Bundy, and although I have tried to research whether he could have been in Illinois, specifically the Moline area,